What you're about to see is a collection of every Halo short that I've ever uploaded as of October 4th, 2024. Minor modifications have been made to a few of them just to better augment the viewing experience, but for the most part they remain unchanged. So sit back, relax, and enjoy some Halo lore. Everybody knows about Rtas Vadam, the white elite missing part of his jaw, but have you heard of one of his most trusted allies? His right-hand man, Stolt the Ungoi. Stolt may be a grunt, a species that isn't known for their strength or intelligence, but let me tell you, Stolt was anything but weak or stupid. Rtas was so fond of Stolt that he would often ask him for his opinions on combat strategies and missions. When he initially joined the Shadow of Intense crew, Rtas Vadam's ship, he was heavily scrutinized by his elite compatriots. In time, they would all learn to respect him. Regardless of who he sparred against, Stolt would eventually win, tanking any blows from his opponents until they became tired, leaving them open to a barrage of attacks from his hardened, crab-like fists. This grizzled grunt was so well respected that he led his very own contingent of elites into battle, and most notably, single-handedly took on and defeated a Spartan in combat. Stolt is not your average everyday Ungoi, he is something far more deadly. But fortunately, he would eventually join the Swords of St. Helios, the very same faction led by Thel Vadam, otherwise known as the Arbiter. If you like this short and want to know more about Stolt, I have a full-length video covering his entire story on the channel. Give it a watch. This is a hunter. This is also a hunter. Let me explain. Hunters, otherwise known as Lekgolo, are one of the most unique species in the Halo universe. Each hunter you encounter in-game is actually a colony of much smaller individual worms. When they physically interact with each other in large groups, they form bigger and far more complex versions of themselves. One worm on its own doesn't appear to be sentient, but combines several hundred and they become thinking beings with names, loved ones, and aspirations. Thanks to their unusual biology, they're able to combine together to create a bunch of unique forms and variants, which are referred to as gestalts. One of these gestalts just so happens to be the inner workings of Scarabs. Have you ever seen Captain Key's terminal in Halo CE? Its contents are absolutely horrifying and depict the internal mental struggle between Keys and the Flood as he attempts to postpone his inevitable consumption. What if I told you this terminal is somehow even scarier, somehow even more messed up than it initially seems? The Flood are by far the greatest threat that exists within Halo's universe, not only because of their numbers and battlefield efficiency, but primarily thanks to their cunning intelligence. One of their most common strategies is to speak through the bodies of a person's loved ones for intimidation and to provoke a feeling of hopelessness. I believe that Key's terminal was intentionally placed here by the Flood using their strange, almost telepathic abilities so that the Master Chief would find it and be forced to watch as the man he knew, his friend and potentially father figure, was slowly and torturously destroyed. Do you remember the White Elite in Halo 2 and 3? The one missing half of his jaw? That's Rtas Vadam, one of the Arbiter's greatest allies. Rtas was not only instrumental in aiding Arbiter with the formation of the Swords of St. Helios, but he was also responsible for helping humanity fight the Flood on Earth in Halo 3. The half-jaw St. Heli had an intimate and ugly relationship with the Flood. He understood better than most that they needed to be stopped at all costs, even if it meant destroying all of Africa. Rtas' first altercation with the Flood was aboard a ship called the Infinite Jha'kaar. Initially sent there to extract a minor profit, he would end up discovering a blossoming Flood threat, quickly uncovering their plans to use the ship's slip space capabilities to flee the system. Rtas and his troops made their way through the Jha'kaar, each eventually succumbing to the parasitic hive mind, all but Rtas. As the sole survivor, he would destroy the infestation, but not before having to kill an infected friend, a master swordsman, and come face to face with the proto-gravemind. Though Rtas was victorious in the fight, he lost half of his jaw in the process. I'm sure you've noticed the drastic visual change between this guy and this guy. What if I told you that this wasn't just an art style shift, and that these Ungoi are actually different races? Much like variations within humankind, different Ungoi from different parts of their homeworld look unique from one another. This OG is a Kafov grunt. You'll see these guys throughout the original trilogy, Reach, ODST, and most recently, Halo Infinite. This one is a Zimzib. You probably remember him from Halo 4. This guy is a Rit, primarily found throughout Halo 5. Each of these grunts may look quite separate from one another, but each one is an Ungoi all the same. Hunters, or Lekgolo, are actually large conglomerates of worms that combine together to create various forms, which are known as gestalts. Each of these gestalts is composed of a slightly different variant of Lekgolo worm. The Mega Lekgolo are the large bipedal forms seen in-game. Difo Lekgolo were specifically raised by the Sanshayum to navigate the inner workings of the Forerunner key ship located in the heart of High Charity. Rulo Lekgolo are employed within mining platforms such as Scarabs. Sabao Lekgolo are bigger gestalts of Rulo Lekgolo used in larger excavators like the Harvester. Thano Lekgolo are a special gestalt that were modified by the Forerunners in an attempt to harness their immunity to the Flood. These were later stored deep within the subsurface of Alpha Halo and subsequently released upon its destruction. The final gestalt is called Kanto Lekgolo, and unfortunately, any record of this enigmatic subspecies was lost with the fall of High Charity. Much like the Ungoi, Jackals or Keyminds have undergone some significant visual changes over the years. These changes are actually different variants of the Keyminds species, all of which originate from a different portion of their home star system. Much like the different races within humanity, each morphology has distinct traits and features. The Rutians are from the continent of Rut, located on the surface of their homeworld. These avian adversaries are found throughout Halo 1 through 3, ODST, Reach, and Infinite. The Tavoans, otherwise known as Skirmishers, originate from an asteroid called Tavo within the Jackal's home system and are found within Reach. The Ibishan are much more reptilian in appearance and hail from an isolated volcanic continent on the surface of the Keyminds homeworld. You'll find these ugly fellows throughout Halo 4 and 5. The Covenant Fringe is one of the coolest and probably most unexplored concepts in all of Halo's lore. During the Covenant's Great Conquest, they stumbled upon many different species, ranging from the Ungoi to the Lekgolo. Not all of the different aliens they discovered were cut out for average military roles, which is why you've never seen the ones I'm about to mention in-game. As of right now, we only know of 3 Covenant Fringe races, the first of which are called the Dazreme. These aquatic aliens lived underwater on their homeworld of Reem. The Yonhet first appeared in Halo Nightfall and were used mostly as smugglers. Thanks to their very small population, they were able to avoid conscription into the Covenant military. The Sharquoi are massive 16-foot tall hulking beasts and were very sparingly used on the front lines by the Covenant. When they were, it typically resulted in complete annihilation on both sides. These enigmatic creatures are, much like the Lekgolo, immune to flood infection, a fact that the Forerunners tried and failed to exploit. The Dazreme are one of several alien races within the Covenant Fringe, a collection of strange alien species that were mostly kept off of the front lines during the Human-Covenant War. These strange water-dwelling creatures lived on their almost exclusively water-covered homeworld of Reem, inhabiting a vast array of Forerunner structures that were submerged within the planet's oceans. Bizarrely, these unusual beings had somehow repurposed the wealth of Forerunner technology that existed around them, which is what allowed them to create such a complex and self-contained society. Each Dazreme is covered in placoid scales, the same type of scales that cover sharks and rays on Earth. These scales come in many different colors and variations, giving each Dazreme a very unique appearance. After some time, the Sanshayum within the Covenant managed to form a peace treaty with the creatures in hopes of exploiting their unique understanding of Forerunner technology. The Dazreme became a closely guarded secret. The coordinates of their planet were only known to very few individuals, and the information was carefully kept away from the Sangheli. The Yonhet are one of the more unusual species within the Covenant that hailed from a moon called Yonhet. These odd humanoids were part of the Covenant Fringe, a collection of alien races that were used in more atypical ways. For example, the Yonhet are best known for their smuggling skills and were usually employed as relic hunters. Thanks to their very small population, they were able to avoid conscription into the Covenant military. The Yonhet are a very clever species. When they were presented with the Covenant's religious beliefs, they simply pretended that they believed in the Great Journey, likely as a means to save their own skins. Once the Covenant was broken, the Yonhet made themselves much more known by forming contracts and trading with various splinter factions. In some cases, Yonhet individuals were lucky enough to secure places of leadership within unspecified Covenant remnants. In others, they were disregarded completely, bullied, or worse, enslaved. The Sharquoi are 16-foot tall behemoths that are part of an unusual subset within the Covenant Fringe. Of all the species that were part of this enigmatic portion of the organization, the Sharquoi were by far the most intimidating. These monstrosities were only used in battle in desperate situations because placing them on the front lines usually resulted in annihilation on both sides of the conflict. Thanks to their absurd strength and resilience, the Forerunners attempted to use them against the Flood, controlling them with an odd construct referred to as the Vertex. On their own, they're not particularly intelligent, but in large groups, they're able to pool their combined brainpower together and effectively create a small hive mind, a group of creatures that think as one. Each Sharquoi is covered in a thick hide of skin, and protruding from the end of each arm are 2 sharp spikes made of bone. The Sharquoi may be blind, but placed on the center of their enormous heads is another chunk of bone, which is highly sensitive and used for echolocation. I just recently made a complete Halo bestiary that details over 200 different creatures. Definitely give that a watch if you want to know more about what calls the Halo universe home. Throughout the entirety of Halo 2, you'll encounter deadly Keyminds warriors wielding beam rifles. These sharpshooters are infamous for being exceptionally deadly. So much so that they became known for their ability to hit virtually any target with almost supernatural timing and precision. Each of these deadly pirates was personally selected by Regret himself thanks to their seemingly innate skill set. Though very few were privy to the name of their group, the Jha'kaar, many heard the rumors of Keyminds snipers hitting shots that were, for all intents and purposes, impossible. Despite their obvious skill, many were killed by the Master Chief in the streets of New Mombasa and on the surface of Installation 05. They may have had a quick trigger finger, but hollow bones break easily when smashed with gauntleted fists. Whether or not more of this deadly group still exists, or what their current allegiances would be, is unknown. Did you know that Sergeant Avery Johnson is actually a Spartan? Let me explain. Oni had dreamt of super soldier projects for quite some time, but none ever made it past the planning phases until the Orion project. The goal of Orion was simple: outfit select individuals with biochemical augmentations through injections. Unlike the Spartan 2s, those who were conscripted were adult volunteers, more akin to the Spartan 4 program. There was no moral gray area for selection, but that didn't stop Oni from compartmentalizing the information and keeping the entire project very secret. An exact list of those who participated in the program is still unknown, with only 5 named individuals. If their bodies accepted the augmentations, they'd become far more efficient in battle than your average soldier. Ultimately, though, the project was deemed too expensive and new volunteers were never selected. Many years later, Halsey would begin developing the Spartan 2 project, and in so doing, used some of the research garnered during Orion. She figured it was only fair to acknowledge those before her, so she named her own project Spartan 2, thus retroactively making Orion Spartan 1. This is the Arbiter, otherwise known as Thel Vadam. A member of the Sangheili race and an elite warrior within the Covenant's military, Thel Vadam was an absolute menace to human society. He was the youngest of his kind to ever achieve the rank of shipmaster and was responsible for the death of over 1 billion human beings. Devout in his religious convictions, Thel served the leaders of the Covenant without question, even when they blamed him for the destruction of an ancient Forerunner artifact that their religion stated was key to transcendence. He became an Arbiter, a martyr sent on suicidal missions for his supposed sins. He continued to follow orders in this position until the Covenant betrayed him and his entire species. A civil war broke out within the Covenant and their religion was revealed to be a sham. Like the wise warrior he is, he made the decision to join forces with his previous foes, humanity. Together with the help of the Master Chief, the two of them destroyed the Covenant, a growing parasitic alien threat called the Flood, and helped usher in peace between humankind and Sangheili. The Master Chief is one of the most badass warriors that humanity has ever seen. Before his ascent to Super Soldier, he was a nobody by the name of John. At the ripe old age of 6, he was selected for a top-secret project orchestrated by a shady government organization known as ONI. They abducted him, and at 14, he was subjected to a brutal onslaught of genetic augmentations with the potential to disfigure or kill him. As you probably already know, he survived, and his survival meant he'd go on to complete more missions than just about anyone. He'd start by destroying key terrorist leadership and human rebellions before a deadly group of alien races would make themselves known: the Covenant. These xenophobes were hell-bent on humanity's annihilation, but John's skill and almost supernatural luck helped him come out victorious. He is one of the most efficient warriors, a great man, a dedicated friend, and an absolute force to be reckoned with. He'd helped destroy the Covenant, an ancient parasitic hive mind called the Flood, a deadly warrior from the past and a member of the Forerunner race, and so much more. Sergeant Johnson actually had somewhat of an immunity to the Flood. In his younger days, Avery Johnson was part of a clandestine project funded by ONI called Orion. This was the precursor to the Spartan 2 program, and much like the 2s, Johnson was given several augmentations, but as an adult instead of a child. These augmentations had tons of effects on his body, some good and some bad. This meant he had been genetically altered. Johnson and likely the other Spartan 1 candidates had Boren's syndrome, which was supposedly a rare disease. Symptoms included tumors and migraines and was supposedly directly caused from overexposure to certain kinds of radiation emitted from Covenant weaponry. Johnson got it from spending too much time around plasma grenades. Sound like bullshit? That's because it is. The entire disease was manufactured as a cover story by ONI to hide his genetic abnormalities. The craziest part? This so-called sickness gave him an increased resistance to the Flood. This is the helmet cam recording of Private Wallace Jenkins, who somehow survived being infected by the Flood. The infection form that attached to him was weak, and he could feel as it took control of his body. However, his consciousness remained intact, and an internal struggle began. Jenkins versus what he referred to as the Other, the presence of the Flood within his own mind. Jenkins knew there was no way to save himself. He just wanted to die. Unable to control his own actions, he remained a passenger as the Flood shambled towards a squad of ODSTs. Instead of killing him, they captured him and held him within a base they had established on Alpha Halo. Thanks to the weakened state of the infection form that had possessed him, he was able to warn the ODSTs of a Flood threat growing just below their outpost. Eventually, he was transported to a local Covenant ship and was able to momentarily retake control of his body. He attempted to destroy the craft so the Flood couldn't use it to escape the ring, but he failed. The ODST that captured him understood just like he did that the ship must be destroyed, so she detonated a frag grenade by the ship's reactor, and in the explosion, Jenkins was finally put out of his misery. If you're interested in hearing a more detailed version of Jenkins' story, I have a full-length video about it on the channel. Go check it out. The Forerunners are an ancient and mysterious race, but something far more mysterious existed before them: the Precursors. These godlike beings transcended the Forerunners, creating technology and having a physiology so bizarre and advanced that no one really understands how they functioned. According to the last of their kind, their race had created much of the life within the galaxy. They claimed the mantle of responsibility, meaning they'd be stewards of all living beings. As their creations progressed, they picked one species to inherit this mantle: humanity. This caused great jealousy within the Forerunners, and a portion of their kind lashed out at the Precursors, exterminating most of their species. Those that survived fled to the outer reaches of the galaxy, and in an attempt to hide, ground themselves up into a fine powder, lying dormant and hopefully reforming themselves later. All of the time spent in this state led to their corruption, and anyone who came into contact with the strange powder would be afflicted with a terrible shaping sickness, which would come to be known as the Flood. You know what I absolutely love in Halo? The names given to the UNSC's ships. One of the most recognizable is the Pillar of Autumn. Just listen to that. The Pillar of Autumn. It sounds eloquent, yet striking and monumental. It's a name that invokes sturdy architectural strength, punctuated by beautiful fall colors. Forward Unto Dawn is another great one. It sounds so regal and determined, as if no matter the odds, we push onwards into a new day. I love the feeling of hope that it instills. How about the 2 for Flinching? That's a name that says, I'll kick your ass and everyone knows it. Can't forget about the noble sounding Spirit of Fire. It just sounds incorruptible and courageous. Euclid's Anvil, named after the Greek mathematician and considered to be the father of geometry, is really cool too. Armageddon's Edge is so heavy metal, it's a name that says, we will bring the apocalypse upon our foes. Ready or Not is another great one. They don't care if you're prepared. Regardless, they're gonna mess you up. Halo's Forerunners have awesome names. The Forerunners clearly took great care when they assigned a title to something. Art and poetry was an integral part of their society. Even their names are poetic, and a lot of the times really beautiful. Born Stellar makes Eternal Lasting as one such example of an incredible sounding name. Sure, it's a little bit of a mouthful, but I love how steeped in meaning it is. He was born among the stars, and he makes eternity last. Absolutely beautiful. Faber of Will and Might? That is a badass sounding name, a name that just oozes strength. The Didact's name, prior to its current designation, was Shadow of Sundered Star, a fitting title for such a capable warrior. First Light Weaves Living Song is the Librarian's true name, and it's just gorgeous. Splendid Dust of Ancient Suns was a Forerunner politician with a name as grandiose as his goals. Okay, one more. Glory of a Far Dawn. Did you know that there's actually examples of time travel in the Halo universe? When the Forerunners were preparing to activate the rings, communications between different portions of their fleet became really difficult and just plain weird. It was as if the rings had already been detonated even though they hadn't. Their destructive power was so absolute that it seemed to reverberate through time itself. Individuals were receiving messages from the future, from their final moments before they were killed. Ghosts from the future instead of the past. This isn't the only example though, there are a few others. The most notable being the events of I Love Bees. Somehow an AI from the 26th century had fragmented and a portion of her was transported to the 21st century via a strange slipspace event. Part of the AI ended up in the servers of a website called I Love Bees. From here, she would communicate with visitors of the site. Even the chief himself seemingly traveled back in time to save some Spartans on Reach, thanks to a strange Forerunner crystal. The flood develops through several stages as infection rate increases. The very first is called the feral stage and is characterized by anarchy. There is no gravemind, and because of this, the flood lacks unification. Next is coordinated. Once a gravemind has been formed, the flood begins to employ complex battle strategies and develops advanced intelligence. After coordinated comes interstellar. The flood has acquired enough knowledge and technology to leave the original source of infection, taking to the stars to consume entire worlds. During Halo 2 and 3, they had just barely entered this phase. The last few stages are purely hypothetical, as fortunately none have been recorded. After interstellar comes transgalactic. This is when the flood have gained technology capable of transporting them from one galaxy to another. They may have reached this stage already and have been lying dormant outside of the Milky Way ever since. Next is universal, the complete and total assimilation of an entire universe. Beyond that, multiversal. In this case, the flood has gained the ability to consume multiple universes, hopping from one dimension to another. Let's talk about the time that a human being planned to glass Earth. Naomi 010 was abducted at the age of 6 from her loving father, Steffan Sentzke. Like every other Spartan 2, she was conscripted into the military, forced to undergo horrific genetic augmentations and brutally strict training regimens. Most of the children taken for the program were replaced with cloned versions of themselves, clones that were genetically unstable and only lived very brief and unpleasant lives. Somehow, this particular Spartan's father was a little too smart for his own good. Instead of accepting that his daughter died of some rare congenital disease, he managed to discover the truth. His child had been stolen from him by the military. As a citizen of humanity's outer colonies, he blamed the UNSC, and by extension, Earth, for the kidnapping of his offspring. In the wake of the fall of the Covenant, he was able to acquire an ex-Covenant ship with a glassing beam, and was planning to use it on the surface of Earth as retribution for the loss of his kid. Fortunately, he was later reunited with Naomi, and because of this, called off his strike on Earth. ODSTs, or Orbital Drop Shock Troopers, are one of the UNSC's greatest warriors, but one squad in particular stands above the rest. Alpha 9 is a group of 6 to 7 ODST individuals, the roster of which changed frequently over the years. The most notable composition was led by Edward Buck during the events of Halo 2. The members of that current iteration of the squad included Taylor Miles, or Dutch, Michael Crespo, or Mickey, Kojo Agu, or Romeo, Jonathan Doherty, aka the Rookie, and their commanding officer, Veronica Dare. On a classified mission into the heart of the Covenant's invasion on Earth, Alpha 9 would help snatch a Tier 1 asset, an alien supercomputer called a Huragok, or engineer, that had highly sensitive and extremely valuable information to the UNSC. This engineer led to the discovery of an ancient and long-buried portal hidden beneath the continent of Africa that would be instrumental in humanity's victory over the Covenant. Alpha 9 would become fractured sometime later thanks to a foolish decision by Mickey, which led to the death of their newest member, the Rookie. Nowadays, the surviving members all have become Spartan 4s. Halo's elites, or Sanghili, are a lot more than just fun adversaries to engage with in combat. These reptilian bipedal aliens hail from their homeworld of Sanghelios and its 2 moons, Kikost and Suban. Their role in the Covenant was to fight for and serve the prophets, or Sanshayum. They took this job very seriously. Deeply religious and devout in the teachings of the Covenant's religion, the Great Journey, these honor-bound warriors would serve the Greater Covenant with unflinching resolve. Culturally, even before the Covenant, the Sanghili valued fighting prowess above all and believed that fair and honorable combat was integral to finding leadership. Once the Covenant was fractured and the truth about their religion was known, many elites became deeply confused. Their entire purpose was to fight for the good word of the Great Journey. This caused many tensions within their society, as some opted to aid humanity against what remained of the Prophet leadership, and others refused to move on from the Covenant's deeply flawed ways. As the Flood develops, Keyminds are created. These entities can then command and control all local Flood forces. Contrary to popular belief, Keyminds are not a form above Gravemind, and in fact come in several known shapes and configurations. A Gravemind is a subset of Keymind. The smallest Keymind is the Abomination, which are highly specialized versions of the Juggernaut form. These hulking behemoths are capable of more complex thought and battle strategy when compared to typical combat forms, but are also only created in situations where the Flood must remain mobile. They're able to control large contingents of Flood and are deadly combat-capable monsters in of themselves. In a situation where the Flood can create a stationary hive, a Gravemind will begin forming, but before a Gravemind is fully created, a Proto-Gravemind takes shape. Proto-Graveminds are the first steps of Flood coordination. In this phase, they begin absorbing the minds of those they infect until they reach a critical point and become full-blown Graveminds. A Gravemind has the knowledge of anything the Flood has ever infected, and once they are created, every single Flood entity can think and move as one. This is the Arbiter. This is also the Arbiter. Let me explain. The term Arbiter isn't a name. Instead, it's a title given to certain Sangheili individuals. In their ancient history, it was given to only the most prestigious military leaders, the absolute best warriors their species had to offer. Once the Covenant was formed, this practice continued. The highest achievable honor was to earn the title of Arbiter, but under the Covenant, it was only attainable from the Hierarchs, the highest positions of power within the Covenant, always held by the Sanshayum. That was until an Arbiter by the name of Fal-Shavami rejected the Covenant's religious zealotry and rebelled. He would be slain in combat by one of his own kind not long after, and preceding his death, the Sanshayum leaders within the Covenant twisted the title to their own ends. The term Arbiter would now be a mark of contempt, applied only to the greatest Sangheilis who had failed in their duties. It was no longer an honor, but a badge of shame. The Spirit of Fire is one of the UNSC's greatest ships, thanks to its invaluable crew. Time and time again, against innumerable odds, they have remained victorious. The most notable individuals aboard the ship have included Sergeant John Forge, an absolute badass Marine that somehow managed to defeat one of the Covenant's deadliest Arbiters in 1v1 combat. Professor Ellen Anders, an absolute genius scientist that rivals Catherine Halsey, one of the primary minds behind the creation of the Spartan program. Red Team, a trio of deadly Spartan 2s consisting of Alice 130, Douglas 042, and their leader Jerome 092. Serena, a smart AI that seemingly matches the intelligence of Cortana. Isabel, another smart AI with an intimate understanding of the Banished. And last, but absolutely not least, the captain of the ship, Captain James Cutter. His leadership would propel them from one victory to another, repelling Covenant forces on the planet Harvest, destroying a localized flood outbreak, and most impressively, surviving a vicious onslaught from Banished forces far higher in number than their own. Is Atriox unintentionally the savior of the Halo universe? Spoilers for Halo Infinite ahead. In Halo 2, Cortana got trapped with the Gravemind. Over 100,000 years before that, another Gravemind had figured out a way to infect inorganic minds through conversation, a trick which would become known as the Logic Plague. During Cortana's time with the monster, it attempted to use this strategy on her. Fortunately, the Chief arrived to save her before he could make any real progress, or at least so it seemed. Cortana would eventually die in battle, but a corrupted fragment of her consciousness would survive. This fragment somehow made its way into a Forerunner information network, gaining control of ancient and deadly machines called Guardians. Using these Guardians, she was able to take control of the entire galaxy. That was until Atriox found her and attempted to disable her once and for all. What if Cortana came back crazy because of her conversation with the Gravemind, and her rise to power was all part of its plan to weaken the galaxy for the Flood's inevitable return? If that's true, her defeat at the hand of Atriox would make him the savior of the entire Halo universe. The Grunts, or Ungoi, are far more than just weak cannon fodder. These tenacious aliens seem small when in the shoes of super soldiers, but their average height is about 5 feet or 1.5 meters. They're also by no means weak, and thanks to their hard skin can pack one hell of a punch. They're often treated like dirt by other species within the Covenant and are perceived as useless despite their ferocity. The Kigyar in particular have a strong hatred for the Ungoi, a fact that makes interspecies relations very difficult. These ugly dudes breed incredibly fast, making them the perfect fit for medial roles and replaceable positions in the military. Thanks to their rapid breeding, most of the Ungoi faced in-game are likely children, which would explain their seeming ignorance and cowardice. One of the strangest aspects of the Grunts is that they're one of the only species within the Covenant that need their own air tanks. Those strange packs on their backs contain their own breathable atmosphere, which is mostly composed of methane. This cream-of-the-crop elite group of Spartans were each handpicked and placed into highly strategic battles thanks to their exceptional skill. Comprised of mostly Spartan 3s and a single Spartan 2, Noble Team was instrumental in the defeat of the Covenant by helping deliver a fragment of an extremely powerful AI named Cortana to the Master Chief. Carter, Kat, Emil, Noble 6, and George all heroically sacrificed their lives in an attempt to save one of humanity's worlds, their military stronghold of Reach. The only survivor, June, was responsible for escorting one of humankind's greatest scientific minds to safety. Though he lived, the sacrifice of his comrades and friends would impact him greatly. He would no longer serve on the front lines, but instead help create the next generation of Spartan super soldiers, the Spartan 4s. Noble Team fought tooth and nail to defend Reach, and despite the fact that the planet ultimately fell, their courage would eventually help guide humanity to victory. Dr. Halsey is the mind behind the Spartans and some of the most technologically advanced AI constructs. In terms of intelligence, Halsey is the Albert Einstein of her era. Her questionable sense of morality, willingness to sacrifice others for the greater good, and brilliant scientific mind secured her a position as the head of the Spartan 2 project. The augmentations, some of the designs of Mjolnir armor, and many of the details regarding the conscription process were all devised by her. She comes across as cold and calculated, but feels a maternal connection to all of her Spartans. Her work with super soldiers isn't the only thing she's known for. Her advancements in artificial intelligence are just as noteworthy and impressive. One of her greatest creations, the AI Cortana, was generated from a living human brain, which was the first time this had ever been attempted. Nowadays, many of the secrets surrounding the brutality of the Spartan Project are known, but Halsey is still one of humankind's greatest minds, and despite the horrific nature of some of her actions, has continued to work with the UNSC to help humanity. The Jackals, or Keyminds, are actually just space pirates. These bird-like creatures are one of the Covenant's most valuable foot soldiers and some of their deadliest snipers. They joined the Covenant for reasons other than religion, though. They're there strictly for profit. Each battle a Keyminds joins isn't for some perceived noble cause or sense of honor. All they care about is the thrill of the hunt, and most importantly, the reward after. This mentality originates from their time spent on their homeworld, where they would sail across its oceans in search of new valuables to pilfer. Keyminds society is matriarchal, meaning their women are their leaders. Though there are at least 3 different variants of their species, the most well-known are the Rutians, thanks to their high population and frequent deployment in Covenant ground operations. They may not have any wings, but they are essentially hyper-evolved birds, meaning they have hollow bones and sometimes feather-like quills. The Prophets, or Sanshayum, are the Covenant's religious leaders. One of the first of 2 species to form the Covenant, the Sanshayum, primarily serve as leaders and dignitaries within the Covenant's government and theocratic institutions. These long-necked aliens are notoriously silver-tongued and gained the reputation of being master manipulators. Though they don't often serve combat roles in the Covenant's military, their influence is just as deadly, especially the 3 prophet hierarchs essentially in charge of leading the entire Covenant. These odd creatures were traditionally considered very beautiful and sensual, but the ones we see in-game are old and feeble. They make use of gravity chairs instead of walking, so over time they became extremely physically unfit. Kinda like Wall-E, just not fat. The Sanshayum were also responsible for delegating power to the other beings in the Covenant, typically through the dispersal of Forerunner technology. The Covenant are an organization of alien races that, for the most part, all work together under the same religious principles. They believe in the Great Journey, a religion that deifies the Forerunners and claims that activating deadly pieces of technology left behind by them, the Halo Rings, is the key to godlike transcendence. The primary races within the Covenant are the Sanshayum, or Prophets, mostly functioning as leaders and dignitaries. The Sanghili, or Elites, the faction's primary warriors. The Ungoi, or Grunts, serve as cannon fodder foot soldiers. The Geralhanai, or Brutes, are also warriors, but deployed more sparingly due to their aggressive tendencies. The Keyminds, or Jackals, are pirates for hire. They care not for the Covenant's religion. The Lekgolo, or Hunters, are hulking beasts used as heavy infantry. The Drones, or Yanmei, are large insectoids deployed as foot soldiers and mechanics. And finally, the Huragok, or Engineers, which serve as technological slaves. The Banished aren't just some new Covenant replacement. This brute-led group is one of several Covenant splinters, new organizations that had broken away and spawned from the Covenant to fulfill their own goals. This particular faction is unique in that they formed at the height of the Covenant's power, and despite many attempts to stamp them out, they were never defeated. Once the Covenant finally fractured, the Banished really started to flourish. A large power vacuum needed to be filled, and Atriox, their leader, was willing to step up to the plate. Atriox had no religious affiliations, and he had no prejudice towards any particular race. Anyone could join his faction, even humans, so long as they were willing to fight. Angry at how he and many others had been treated under the Covenant's rule, Atriox vowed to give everyone a fair chance, from Ungoi to Sanghili and everything in between. Cortana is an artificial intelligence created from the brain of a brilliant cloned scientist named Catherine Halsey. Halsey cloned herself solely for the purpose of harvesting this clone's mind and using it to create Cortana. As terrible as that sounds, if it weren't for the inception of Cortana, humanity would have surely been destroyed. Her main purpose was to perfectly complement a Spartan 2 of her choosing, and after some deliberation, she picked John 117. The dynamic duo would become inseparable as they battled the Covenant, the Flood, and even Forerunners. Without Cortana, Chief likely wouldn't have succeeded in many of his suicidal missions. In one desperate battle, she decided to sacrifice herself to save the Chief, a decision that would have immense untold side effects later. After her heroic end, a corrupted fragment of her personality reappeared, possessing ancient Forerunner machines called Guardians, and with them took control of the galaxy. Her foothold was short-lived, however, and she would eventually sacrifice herself once again to aid the Chief. Blue Team are some of the most seasoned warriors in all of the UNSC. Originally, this group's composition was constantly in flux. Spartans were assigned and reassigned to different teams throughout their years of combat, and Blue Team was no exception. It wasn't until later, when a significant number of Spartan 2s began dying out, that a slightly more concrete roster would form. The current and most well-known list is as follows. John 117, the Master Chief, typically considered to be the team's leader. Fred 104, famous for his dry sense of humor and skills with combat blades. Fred technically outranks the Chief, but he respects him so greatly he chooses to let John lead. Kelly 087 is the fastest Spartan to have ever existed, and arguably John's closest friend. Last, but absolutely in no way least, is Linda 058, the team's lone wolf recon specialist, and known for her abilities with a sniper. Blue Team has one of the highest mission counts in the entire UNSC, having participated in over 220 operations. The Cole Protocol is a brilliant tactical concept devised by a UNSC admiral named Preston J. Cole. This essential strategy was successfully employed to prevent the Covenant from discovering Earth until Regret's arrival in 2552. In order to follow this law, all UNSC ships evacuating from engagements were forbidden from plotting direct slip-space courses to any known human population. If for any reason the captain of a ship became aware of its intended capture or imminent destruction, all data, especially navigational, was to be wiped from their ship's systems before initiating self-destruction. The UNSC used this methodology extensively throughout the Human Covenant War, and in some instances afterwards as well. The Cole Protocol was so important to humanity that those under the UNSC banner were instructed to view its contents every day, implementing eye-tracking software in each instance to ensure it was read fully. The Master Chief is a badass, and he's done some crazy stuff in his life. At the age of 14, he fought 4 ODSTs in hand-to-hand unarmed combat, killing 2 of them and crippling the others. The first time he ever wore his Mjolnir power armor, he literally deflected a missile with his arm. After the Covenant placed a bomb onto one of Earth's defense stations, he plummeted through the vacuum of space towards a Covenant cruiser and armed the bomb inside it. He almost single-handedly fought through the Covenant's holy city and capital, killing any soldier dumb enough to get in his way. The Chief literally fell from orbit twice, once during the beginning of Halo 3 and another time during the beginning of Halo 4. He had to jump on top of a deadly attack craft in flight to get to the Didact in Halo 4. He once punched a Banshee, hurtling towards him at full speed. And he's been given every single military award except for Prisoner of War, because the man can't be captured. The M99 Stanchion might just be one of the UNSC's deadliest weapons. This 44-pound semi-automatic magnetic rifle fires rounds at 15,000 meters per second. It functions in roughly the same way as the beautiful and destructive Gauss cannon, making use of magnetic coils to fling projectiles at frightening speeds. It's essentially an unmounted Mac driver and is exceptionally useful against fleshy targets. Sadly, it's only ever appeared in game one time as an upgrade to the sniper units in Halo Wars 2. Its large size and high weight make it hard to use though, and because of that, it's typically only employed when targets are far in the distance and the user is mostly immobile. It's also a recoilless weapon, making it extremely effective in low-gravity scenarios. Unfortunately, despite its obvious operational efficiency, manufacturing of the weapon ceased in 2521. I don't know about you, but the Gauss cannon is one of my favorite weapons in Halo, and I would absolutely love to get my hands on what is effectively a handheld version. Maybe someday we'll get this in an FPS Halo game. That would be awesome. These are a few amazing canon Halo ads that have released over the years. Starting with the atmospheric Halo 3 teaser Starry Night. This short depicts a young Master Chief laying in a grassy field with a childhood friend. Halo 3 also saw the release of Landfall, a series of live-action shorts that showed some of the earliest battles with the Covenant on Earth, just before the Chief arrived aboard the Forerunner keyship. Without a doubt, one of the most famous is the Believe ad campaign, a series of in-universe documentaries that take place in Halo's future. These live-action clips show several now aged Marines recalling some of the events of Halo 3. This is where the incredible diorama ad first made its appearance. The original Halo Wars announcement trailer is Canon 2, depicting a battle on Harvest that takes place shortly before the game begins. One of my absolute favorites is the Halo 3 ODST trailer called The Life, sometimes referred to as We Are ODST. This incredible live-action short shows an ODST as he moves from basic training grunt to grizzled war veteran. There's an absolutely incredible song used throughout this entire trailer that I just love. It's the track you've been listening to over the course of this video. Some of the most heartfelt moments in Halo Reach actually came before the game itself in the form of its in-universe trailers. This series of canon shorts were all released as promotional material, each detailing events just prior to the start of the game. Day Before, as the title implies, takes place the day before the invasion. It's a collection of 3 other ads: Patrol, Spaceport, and New Life. Spaceport shows a mother as she departs to reach on business, leaving her son and husband behind. New Life depicts an expecting couple as they debate the course of their future. Patrol follows a group of 3 Marines as they prepare to make their way to the location of Reach's first mission, Winter Contingency. If you've played Reach, you already know how their stories end. Tragically. Getting a glimpse into the average person's life like this really helps cement just how gruesome the fall of Reach truly was. The final trailer in this campaign is called Creation of the Monument and illustrates the creative process behind constructing a statue to honor Noble Team's sacrifice. Did you know that the Covenant actually had AIs? Let me explain. Thanks to a misinterpretation of a Forerunner warning detailing the dangers of artificial minds being controlled by the Flood, the Covenant had very strict and technologically debilitating rules against the development of complex AIs. This was often crippling to further iteration on their tech, and likely one of the reasons humanity was eventually victorious. Though these rules existed, some AIs were still produced, albeit with very limited functionality, a pre-programmed dogmatic view of the Great Journey, and the Covenant as a whole. It was because of these intentional shortcomings that UNSC AIs were often able to outperform Covenant technology when interacting with it. The most notable example of a Covenant AI that we've actually seen was the intelligence that was aboard the Truth and Reconciliation. 343 Guilty Spark attempted to converse with the entity, but due to its limited design, it proved unhelpful when probed with questions regarding its creators and was eventually decommissioned by Spark. Have you ever wondered why grunts wear those strange backpacks? Well, here's why. Those strange objects they carry around on their backs are actually their own personal air tanks. Unlike humanity and their Covenant compatriots, their homeworld's atmosphere is mostly composed of methane. So instead of needing an oxygen-rich environment to stay alive, they need methane to survive. Grunts can seemingly safely inhale oxygen-rich atmospheres as well, but without a steady supply of their own air, they would eventually asphyxiate. In case you didn't know, methane is highly flammable and quite volatile. So that means that grunts are literally forced to walk around firefights with what are essentially explosives tied to their backs. That's why when shooting at their tanks, they'll often erupt into a cloud of green smog and fire. Some grunts wear full face masks as well, which can be shot off, producing a similar effect. How terrifying would it be, not only going to war fighting battles you likely won't survive, but under the constant threat of suffocation? One small miscalculation and they could run out of air to breathe and perish. I always just feel so bad for these poor guys. Why is Cortana blue? Let me explain. When an AI is created, they are allowed to choose their appearance. Cortana, as an example, chooses to look like a hot naked lady, but not all AIs make such a decision. Take Serena or the Weapon as an example. Both appear as women wearing more militaristic uniforms. Another example of an AI picking a different, although fairly normal appearance and outfit is Roland. He's based his attire and face on a real British Air Force pilot named Roland Beaumont. Other AIs have taken a similar approach when selecting their appearance as well. Mo Ye chose to appear as an elderly Asian woman with traditional Chinese attire. She modeled herself after an old Chinese folklore story about a weaponsmith who sacrificed herself to create a sword. Some AIs have been known to take slightly more untraditional shapes. Leonidas, for example, took the form of a Greek Spartan helmet with visible eyes and teeth, but no body to speak of. One of the strangest AI appearances, though, is Black Box. He chooses to forego the typical human look that most AIs go for, instead appearing as a blue self-illuminated cube. How exactly does a Spartan in full Mjolnir armor go to the bathroom? Let me explain. Peeing is pretty easy. Each Mjolnir suit comes equipped with an extremely robust filtration system that turns any urine into clean and fresh drinking water. If a Spartan has to go number 1 on the field, they don't need to perform any special actions at all. They just do it and their suit takes care of the rest. But what about the more troublesome bodily function? Well, that's a bit trickier to answer. We know that in some situations, Spartans are forced to remove bits of their armor on the field using tools or with the help of technicians. This would mean that every time a Spartan has to take a dump, they'd have to remove several pieces of armor through a process that is probably quite tedious, especially when considering that their bodies have suddenly enabled a biological timer. Alternatively, a Spartan 2 named Naomi seems to imply their suit handles this problem as well, perhaps via a colostomy bag or something similar. Either way, most Mjolnir isn't exactly easy to remove. In fact, devices have been created to speed up the process, such as the mechanism seen in the end of Halo 4. I suppose it's a small price to pay to wear armor as badass as Mjolnir. A regular Marine almost survived the library solo. Let me explain. The library is considered by many to be one of the most dreaded missions in the entire Halo series, and for good reason. Its dark and dingy atmosphere and lack of notable visual distinctions makes it one of the more difficult missions to navigate. On top of that, its cramped hallways are filled with a deluge of fervorous flood forms intent on your consumption. Many consider this level to be one of the few times where Halo becomes a genuine horror game. This area is not only known for being scary, but also by its difficulty. Even seasoned players will occasionally get overrun or blasted to hell by a trigger-happy rocket-wielding combat form. Though there's no evidence of it in-game, the Chief wasn't the first person to visit the library. Before him, 343 had similarly abducted a man named Marvin Mobuto and led him throughout the complex. Marvin had somehow single-handedly fought his way through the library from the same point the Chief started, almost all the way to the second elevator in the mission. A lone man with no superhuman abilities marched through over half of the labyrinth with nothing but bullets and his wits. Chief eventually stumbled upon his body, too mangled for even the Flood to make use of, and somberly retrieved his dog tags. What if I told you that wedging warthogs into places they don't belong isn't just something that players do, but something that the Master Chief himself has done as well? Halo is one of those unique games where its players are notoriously good at exploiting its mechanics and environments to do really weird things. Glitches and tricks have been a staple of the series pretty much since its inception, with things like warthog launches or super bounces. Halo also has a robust physics system that can be really fun to experiment with. At some point while playing Halo, I'm willing to bet that you've attempted to wedge a warthog or some other vehicle into an area it definitely wasn't intended to be in. For many, that's become part of the fun of the series, and I'd wager one of the reasons it's had such a lasting impact on people as a whole. Discovering new and goofy things and hilarious scenarios with your buddies is an awesome feeling and the kind of experience that creates long-lasting memories. What if I told you that players aren't the only ones doing things like this, and the phenomenon has been directly referenced within the story of Halo itself? During the book The Flood, a novelization of Halo CE, the Master Chief literally drives full speed into a building during the Silent Cartographer, performing part of one of the game's most well-known speedrun skips, just like you and I have many times before. Linda, one of the Master Chief's best friends, died trying to save Reach. Let me explain. At one point during the fall of Reach, Linda and John were given the objective of destroying the nav data aboard a ship called the UNSC Circumference to prevent the Covenant from potentially locating Earth. Once they made their way inside and successfully accomplished their initial goal, they attempted to evacuate from the spacecraft. The Chief ordered some Marines and Linda to get on board a Pelican. Before Linda could get back on the dropship to make a speedy exit, she was hit in the back by a bolt of plasma, followed by another from her front, killing her armor's shields. 2 more projectiles slammed into her chest and a final shot smashed into her helmeted head. John could only watch in horror as he ordered some Marines to haul her now battered body into the Pelican. Shortly after, he gave the flight controls to one of the men and went to attend to the broken Spartan. Her vitals were dangerously low, and after a brief conversation, she flatlined. John was smart though, and despite his grief, he thought on his feet. As quickly as he could, he stuffed her body into a cryopod in hopes that doctors would be able to help her later. Thankfully, this last-ditch effort worked perfectly, and she was later resuscitated. Grunts are sort of crabs. Let me explain. Balaho, the homeworld of the Ungoi, isn't exactly the most hospitable world to live on. Methane is cold and is what their atmosphere is mostly composed of. This means that the planet's average temperatures are frigid, even in the most tropical of locations. To combat these harsh conditions, the grunts evolved to have a thick, chitinous skin-like covering. That's not to say that they're invertebrates, however, they do have bones. In fact, UNSC scientists have speculated that their genetic lineage stretches back to amphibian-like primates. Classifying these strange creatures using Earth taxonomical principles is virtually impossible due to vastly different environmental factors and biological variations. Some variants of the species have a more traditional epidermis as well as rough and bumpy sections of pseudo-exoskeletons. So, in a way, the Ungoi are both vertebrates and arthropods, making them appear, at least on the surface level, to be hyper-evolved crustaceans. Did you know that 343 Guilty Spark used to be human? Let me explain. 100,000 years ago, the Halo rings were fired, killing almost all life in the Milky Way galaxy in an attempt to purge it of flood infection. Before this, humans lived alongside the Forerunners. One such human was a man named Jha'kaar, who had befriended a young Forerunner called Bornstellar. Through a series of insane events, both intentional and unintentional, Bornstellar became an integral aspect of an upcoming war, the Forerunner Flood War. In the time leading up to this, Jha'kaar and Bornstellar had become great friends. The events that forged this bond were complicated, but suffice it to say, the Forerunner had gained a great affection for the human. In the Forerunner's final hour against the Flood, they decided to activate the Halo Rings, which were a galaxy-wide weapon designed purely for complete and total annihilation of all sentient life, thereby starving the Flood and preventing them from spreading any further. In an attempt to preserve his friend Jha'kaar, Bornstellar transferred the human's consciousness into what would eventually become 343 Guilty Spark. Did you know that there was actually another Spartan on the Pillar of Autumn besides the Master Chief? Let me explain. In the waning hours of the fall of Reach, Master Chief was fighting alongside one of his best friends. Linda. In this particular fight, Linda was brutally injured by several rounds of plasma fire, and the wounds she received would end up being the death of her. But wait a minute, Linda is alive and well during Halo 5. How could she have died way before? Well, shortly after her life signs faded, Master Chief placed her body into a cryopod, hoping she'd be resuscitated later. She was, but this cryopod eventually made its way onto the Pillar of Autumn, where it would remain until the ship began its descent towards the first Halo ring. As a failsafe measure, any full cryopods would eject before the vehicle crashed, and thanks to this, Chief was able to pick her up later. So, during the entire first mission of Halo CE, the Pillar of Autumn, Linda's lifeless body was essentially in a freezer somewhere within the ship. Don't believe me? Check this out. See these readouts? These are for Linda, and very clearly display her life signs, or in this case, lack thereof. Did you know that Captain Keyes actually had a relationship with Dr. Halsey? Let me explain. During Keyes' time in officer training school, one of his instructors accidentally got several of his students killed during a poorly planned training exercise. Keyes suffered from plasma burns thanks to his teacher's mistake, but even though he'd been injured, he refused to testify against them. This unshakable loyalty caught the attention of Dr. Halsey, who needed someone she could trust to help her acquire the children for the Spartan program. Together, the two of them would travel to different worlds while Halsey decided which kids to abduct. Once Keyes fully understood the truth behind their goal, Halsey had him reassigned to a much more normal position. 7 years later, the two of them would meet once more during a conference at a university. It was here that the two of them would spend the night together and conceive their daughter. The child would spend the first few years of her life living with Dr. Halsey, who served as a mostly absent mother, far too preoccupied with her work to give her the attention she needed. Having developed a much healthier relationship with her dad over her mom, she eventually decided to change her last name from Halsey to Keyes and to follow in his footsteps by joining the Navy. This girl was Miranda. Ever wondered why the hell 3 completely new Spartans were created for the Halo TV series instead of using established characters like Linda, Fred, and Kelly? Well, what if I told you they weren't actually made up for the show? Let me explain. Within the hallowed halls of 343 Industries exists a massive document, or a series of documents that are absolutely filled to the brim with narrative details about the Halo universe. This collective information has come to be known as the Halo Story Bible, and it contains every bit of lore that has ever been released, plus tons of secret information that has been kept under wraps until a writer reveals it to us. One particular section of this repository contains a list of every single Spartan 2 conscript's name and number designation. Okay, so during Halo Wars, the Spartans of Red Team received backup from a group of 6 other Spartan 2s. 3 of these Spartans were already known to us, but for years, the identity of these other Spartans has remained a mystery until now. Meet Riz, Kai, and Vanek. After their time helping on Arcadia, they'd eventually be reassigned to Silver Team. And no, not just the Silver Team from the TV show, but a Silver Team in the primary universe that we all know and love. Did you know that there was a subset of religious extremists within the Covenant that worshipped the Flood? Let me explain. The Governors of Contrition were a somehow even more zealous group that believed every single Forerunner creation was holy and in need of protection, that every single thing they created was divine. The problem was they also believed that the Flood had been somehow made by the Forerunners, and in a sick sort of way, I suppose they were right. It was, after all, the Forerunners' ancient and long-forgotten genocide against the Precursors that created the parasite to begin with. Regardless of the Flood's origins, the Governors of Contrition were convinced that the monstrous creatures were designed to be the perfect life form, an all-consuming, all-connecting force of divinity. Make us whole, I guess. One particular Sangheili that held this belief was a shipmaster that ordered his soldiers to embrace the Flood, to allow access to their ship and welcome the infestation aboard. Not all under his command agreed with this insane decision, and in response, one of his crew shot him in the back of the head. Ironically, the commander that was killed had been part of a battle group called the Second Fleet of Homogeneous Clarity. Needless to say, his decision and beliefs proved he wasn't exactly willing to be homogeneous, and he most certainly didn't have any clarity. Why were there no brutes in Halo CE? Let me explain. One of the most pivotal battles in the Human Covenant War was when Reach was attacked by a massive invasion force, a portion of which was the Fleet of Particular Justice, one of the largest armadas in the entire Covenant. At the time, its leader was none other than Supreme Commander Thel Vadam. When the Pillar of Autumn fled from Reach to Alpha Halo, Thel followed with all the ships at his command. The fighting style of the Jiralhanae, or Brutes, was very distasteful to someone like himself, who preferred to fight cleanly, avoiding the more dirty strategies and general savagery the apes were known for. It was this distinct difference that created a rift between many elite and brute soldiers, Thel Vadam included. Brutes are volatile and unpredictable, facts that made the Supreme Commander more than a little distrusting of them. He was essentially a space racist, but one might argue for good reason. Either way, it was due to this volatility that he seemingly opted to exclude their species from his command. Every good cohesive group needs teammates that they can trust, and trusting the Brutes was, at least in his eyes, an altogether unwise course of action. Did you know that a Spartan joined the Banished? Let me explain. Ilsa Zane was originally recruited for the Spartan 4 program, specifically one of the very first candidates. At the time, the goal wasn't to simply create new Spartans, it was to create super soldiers that didn't need Mjolnir. Essentially, warriors as powerful as the Spartan II in their iconic suits, but without them. The augmentations that were used on her were highly experimental, and much like the twos before her, had a high chance of failure. They didn't fail, however. In fact, they were a resounding success, but due to their volatility, her mind was severely damaged in the process. Angry that her brain had been irreparably harmed and now clinically insane, she joined a rebel organization, tried to hijack the UNSC Infinity, and eventually found herself in the thralls of the Banished, who she happily joined. Shortly after, she murdered a fellow Spartan, and even though she didn't necessarily need the armor, she claimed it for her own. Throughout his extensive military career, the Master Chief has worn several different sets of armor, each of which an improvement on the last. Let me explain. In the early days of the Human Covenant War, the Chief donned a few variants of Mark IV Mjolnir armor, a set of battle-ready gear that was designed directly alongside the Spartans themselves. Once he journeyed to the first Halo ring, he received a newer set, the Mark V. This armor had several notable improvements from its predecessor, namely the ability to integrate with an AI and the presence of a personal energy shielding device that could self-regenerate. Once the Battle of Installation 04 concluded, his Mark V armor was significantly damaged, and so it was replaced with the Mark VI. The biggest difference from the previous iteration of Mjolnir was the faster recharging shield system. This suit served him well up until he was forced to enter cryosleep following the events on the Ark. During this 4-year slumber, Cortana modified his armor using manufacturing and diagnostic systems within the cryopod he was frozen in. A similar set was created for John after a conflict with the Didact on Installation 03, but it too was eventually damaged by Spartan Locke during a brief altercation. Following those events, he finally acquired the Mark VI Gen 3. Did you know that multiplayer in Halo is actually canon? Let me explain. Slayer, Capture the Flag, King of the Hill, and so on are all in-universe training exercises. These high-tech simulations are called war games and often utilize state-of-the-art virtual reality technology to function. Generally, each match is a simulation where real Spartans compete against one another to hone their skills. That means that each location you're battling in is either a real physical place or a sophisticated simulation of an actual space somewhere else in the universe. Blood Gulch, Lockout, Rat's Nest, Haven, Forge World, and so on are all genuine places in the Halo universe. These exercises mostly take place on the UNSC Infinity, but other places like Anvil Station serve as homes for war games as well. In the case of Anvil, Sangheili individuals participate alongside Spartans, something I imagine these elites probably take a little too seriously given their warrior ways. With all of that being said, now you know that one match where you had a KD of -10 is essentially canon. Thel Vadam, aka the Arbiter, isn't the first Sangheili to receive this title. Let me explain. Though the exact number of Arbiters that have existed over the years is unknown, there are still quite a few individuals that have been documented. Before the Covenant, there were 2 recorded elites that held this title. Ursu Labat, also known as the Tyrant of Kivro, was a powerful leader best known for his unpleasant rule. Vima Togad led the Sangheili in a war against the Sanchayum, or Prophets, before the official formation of the Covenant. Fel Shavami was the Arbiter that inadvertently converted the rank into a mark of shame by rebelling against the Covenant's religious teachings. Jet Lekmuti was responsible for folding the Lekgolo or Hunters into the Covenant. Thanks to Heki Gibadi's mercilessness, he was able to quell the Ungoi or Grunt rebellion by glassing a portion of their homeworld. Ripa Morami, otherwise known as the Savage, was a brutal Sangheili with little care for honor that fell in battle against Sergeant John Forge. There's also Var Gatanai, but he's from the TV show, so we don't talk about him. What's the most dangerous flood form ever encountered in Halo? Let me explain. The apex of flood infection is referred to as a Keymind, a giant amalgamation of bodies and consciousness fused together to create a unified hyperintelligence. The most commonly known Keymind is the Gravemind, and though these monsters are obviously terrifying and extremely deadly, they're not the deadliest form of Keymind. That title would likely have to go to the Blightstalker, a horrific monstrosity only encountered before the firing of the Halo array when the Flood were at their absolute strongest. Entire worlds had been consumed and their ecosystems were transformed into terrifying hellscapes of flood biomass. Life is resilient, however, and will always find a way to survive, even in flood-controlled spaces. To combat this, Blightstalkers roam the fetid wastes, searching for any living creature that was lucky enough to survive during the conversion of the landscape. The exact size and capabilities of these creatures is mostly unknown, but given their purpose, I can only imagine how deadly they must be. Why was the Covenant's technology so superior to humanity's? Let me explain. Every facet of the alien supergroup's shared culture is dictated by their religious beliefs, the foundation of which is the deification of the Forerunners, an ancient race responsible for the creation of the Halo rings and many other similar installations. The primary tenets of their belief system came from exposure to Forerunner technology. In the minds of the Covenant, their machines were essentially so advanced that they were deemed godly. This meant that any objects they discovered that were Forerunner in origin were highly sought after, revered, and most importantly, studied. Most of the Covenant's greatest creations were made by imitating the items they discovered. Due to strict rules, simply because the Forerunner technology was far too advanced, or a combination of the two, the Covenant barely scratched the surface with their reverse engineering efforts. Fortunately for humanity, many of the seemingly arbitrary do's and don'ts of their religion prevented them from truly taking advantage of the full breadth of Forerunner knowledge at their disposal. Halo 3 ODST takes place around the same time as Halo 2, so why are hostile elites almost completely absent? Let me explain. Well, for one, Sangheili soldiers actually are present during the events of the game, they're just not alive. In a few areas of the Mombasa streets, while playing as the Rookie or Buck during Tiari Plaza, several dead elites can be found among the trash-strewn grounds of the city. These dead warriors are one of the first indications that the elites were being betrayed by the Prophets and the Brutes, the earliest phases of the Great Schism. The Arbiter and those aboard High Charity were likely the last of their kind to make this unpleasant discovery, and little did they know that their brothers were being murdered in regions far from Covenant-controlled space. When Regret initiated a slip-space jump to Delta Halo from Earth, an additional invasion force arrived, commanded by Truth. With the Arbiter far away from the conflict on the human world, it was at this time that he likely gave the order to his brute attack dogs to find and kill all of the Sangheili warriors in their midst, thus leading to the corpses seen in the Mombasa streets. How did Cortana psychically communicate with the Master Chief during Halo 3? Let me explain. Anyone that's played Halo 3 is familiar with the moments in which Cortana reaches out to the Master Chief in an attempt to speak to him, and later when the Gravemind does the same thing. A Gravemind houses the collected consciousness of the Flood within its immense body, but it also acts as a command node. Each individual Flood form isn't so much its own thinking organism acting on the Flood's behalf, rather it's an extension of the Flood's singular growing consciousness. This means that each body the Flood infects becomes a foot soldier for the Gravemind, a puppet and an extra body to be used to further proliferate infection. Using a strange and largely unknown science simply referred to as neural physics, the Gravemind is able to telepathically control the bodies it's assimilated. This bizarre ability means it's also capable of reaching out and speaking inside the minds of other living beings. In order to essentially screw with the Chief, the Gravemind used Cortana's voice to send him bizarre messages, effectively utilizing telepathy. What exactly is used in the Needler as ammo? Let me explain. The deadly pink crystals within this unusual subset of Covenant weaponry are called Kemuk Suru and are extremely dangerous. Obviously, large sharp spikes hurtling towards you at blistering speeds is already troublesome, but thanks to their inherent volatility, they will also explode once they've reached their target. Flinging multiple crystals at the same point will amplify the explosion further, causing a chain reaction that is very violent. These odd pink minerals are naturally occurring and are mined on one of the elite's moons, a place called Suban. Firing at a deposit causes it to explode, and once a bundle is detonated, it will splinter, sending shards airborne. In this state, they will seek out the nearest target via what appears to be some kind of self-guided heat-seeking ability. Though projectile-based weaponry is the most obvious application for Kemuk Suru, melee weapons made from the substance have been employed as well, some of which are completely composed of the crystal, and others are simply infused with their energy to make them all the more deadly. Truth, Mercy, Regret. The Holy Trinity. The Prophet Hierarchs. Each of their names is extremely ironic. Let me explain. Truth, arguably the leader of the three, was constantly lying. He lied and backstabbed to get into his position of power, leveraging blackmail and other unsavory tactics to dethrone the previous hierarchs. He lied to his people and to his fellow leaders, but the greatest lie of all was one he convinced even himself was truth, that the activation of the Halo rings would propel those who believed to godhood. Mercy, on the other hand, was anything but merciful. The Elder Prophet possessed the most religious fervor, and with it came an absolute lack of mercy for those that didn't have the same beliefs. Finally, Regret. Foolhardy, overeager, and willing to jump the gun, he was the first to arrive at Earth, with a fleet nowhere near capable of destroying the humans' homeworld. He constantly put himself in situations that he would come to regret, the worst of which being his invasion of Earth. This overzealous decision was what led the Chief to him and ultimately resulted in his death. A series of events he no doubt regretted deeply. George may have survived the events of Halo Reach. Let me explain. Civilizations with adequate technological skills utilize what is essentially a series of dimensions beyond our own to travel at speeds faster than light, self-made wormholes or folds of space-time, in a way. During the Battle of Reach, a Shaw Fujikawa translite engine, one of the devices used by humanity to enter slipspace, was rigged to activate within the center of a Covenant craft that had parked within Reach's orbit. In an act of self-sacrifice, George stayed within the ship to activate the so-called bomb manually. Once detonated, the vessel was destroyed, leaving 2 chunks of its length remaining above Reach, while the third, containing the lone Spartan, was sent to slipstream space. This strange void state is an inhospitable place, and George seemingly perished as a result of direct exposure to it. However, according to the description of Noble Loyalty, George survived the explosion and was transported to a different universe, one in which Japan was seemingly the leading inspiration behind the Spartan program. It reads, "Arriving in a storm of clashing glass, one strange samurai turned imminent defeat into legendary victory." Thus concludes the shorts collection. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, why not subscribe, comment, and share this video? It helps the channel immensely. That's all I've got for you today, so if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go play some Halo.